Hi, everyone. Welcome to another lecture for the Skepticism 101 course at Chapman University. This one on evolution and creationism. I may know more about this subject than any of the others that I lecture on in this course, in as much as I have been following this movement since I was a college student. Really, maybe even before that, when I became a born-again evangelical Christian, I thought I was supposed to be a creationist. I didn't really know much about creationism at all. So I thought I was supposed to be, and then I was surprised when I went to Pepperdine University to discover that they accepted the theory of evolution. And I thought, well, okay, so maybe it's all right. I don't know. I don't really know much about it. So when I went to graduate school at Cal State Fullerton for the first time for a master's in experimental psych, I, on the side, just for fun, took a course in evolutionary biology taught by a professor named Bayard Bratstrom, who was one of the best professors I ever had. And I remember sitting there thinking, this was Tuesday nights from 7 to 10, thinking, oh my God, this stuff really is true. So it was kind of revealing that I thought I was supposed to be a skeptic of evolution, knowing nothing about it, and then accepted it, still knowing nothing about it. I didn't really get it until I actually took a course in it. Anyway, since then, as you can see, like on the screen, I've written a couple books on the subject. In Darwin Shadows, a biography of Alfred Russel Wallace, who co-discovered the theory of evolution by natural selection, and then my book on intelligent design theory, case against it in any case, Why Darwin Matters. By the way, this book here, this is my first book with full frontal nudity. I guess it's okay in America because a lot of Americans are skeptical of the theory. Generally, it's about 40%, 35 to 40% of Americans do not accept the theory of evolution at all. Another 40 to 45% accept it, but as guided by God, and the remaining small percentage of people who accept it without any religious overtones. So that's kind of what we're up against here. You can kind of see that on some of these magazine covers, Time Magazine's Evolution Wars. The push to teach intelligent design raises a question: does God have a place in science class? And National Geographic's Was Darwin Wrong? These are classic examples of Betteridge's law of headlines. That is, any headline that ends in a question mark can be answered no. So, no, God doesn't have a place in science classrooms, and Darwin was not wrong. By the way, just so you never forget, Darwin Day is February 12th, 1809, the same day Abraham Lincoln was born. Not just the same date in the calendar year, but I mean the actual same day. So this year, 2020, when I'm recording this, it's the 211th birthday of Charles Darwin. Happy birthday, Charles Darwin. Darwin was, in fact, born at this place right here, there's a little monument to it, which I visited in 2009, which is the bicentennial of Darwin's birth, and the sesquicentennial of the 150th anniversary of the publication of his Origin of Species. This was the home of his father, Robert Darwin, who was a well-to-do physician, and it was called the Mount. And it's in Shrewsbury, Shropshire, England, which is kind of the southwest area of England, southwest of London. You can actually go visit his bedroom. There's not much there. The whole building is just a government office, but they have a little sign, and you can kind of go in and see where his bedroom was. And here's his grammar school, also in Shrewsbury. The statue of Darwin wasn't there when he was a child, obviously. And you can also visit his church. This is the Unitarian Church in Shrewsbury. The Unitarians were fairly liberal, almost radical at the time, compared to the Trinitarians. Unitarians do not accept the trinary nature of God. That is, most Christians think of God as, Jesus. That God is both the creator of the universe, and Jesus was divine and the Son of God at the same time, which Unitarians found difficult to accept, as would I. And then the Holy Ghost also. So for Unitarians, they're just all the same entity. There's no three different things. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. The point is that Darwin's religious training was fairly liberal, and he ended up abandoning it in his late 20s, early 30s. What he's most famous for, of course, is the voyage of the Beagle, in which the primary mission of the ship was to chart in detail the coastline of South America, and then circumnavigate the globe by going through the Galapagos and Tahiti and through New Zealand, Australia, and back around the Cape of Good Hope. Maybe a little bit more mapping in South America and then back home. That was a 5-year mission. Darwin was not officially the naturalist aboard the Beagle, although he became de facto the naturalist. In fact, he was just the companion to the captain of the Beagle, Fitzroy, Captain Robert Fitzroy, who was a very religious man and an educated man, and he wanted somebody to talk to. Most sailors at the time were largely illiterate and uneducated. But of course, the point of the 5-year voyage that became most famous was this part here, the Galápagos Islands. As you'll see here, they have English names because at the time they were a colony of the British Empire. They now have Spanish names, which I'll show you in a moment. When Ecuador gained its independence, and it retained ownership of the island. So now you have to go through Quito or Guayaquil in Ecuador to get there, and that's part of their tourist trade, which is fine. Anyway, it's about 600 miles off the coast of Ecuador there. That little map tracks the voyage of the Beagle through the Galapagos over the course of about 5 weeks in September of 1835. Okay, there's the Beagle, and this is the San Cristobal Island, the first place that it stopped. That island there, which was called Chatham Island at the time. And just remember that little volcano there, that's called Cerro Brujo. I'm going to show you a picture of that in a moment and the role that played in Darwin's thinking. We know all this because we have the complete charts of the HMS Beagle and everywhere it went, every single day and week and month and year. So here again in more detail, the Beagle comes in this way. It's just scouting around here. It first lands right there, and I'll show you what that looks like right here. It's this island now that was called Chatham at the time. Now it's San Cristobal. To get there now, you fly into this airport, Puerto Bacareza Moreno. It has a large enough runway to handle a major commercial airliner from Ecuador. It just takes, I think it's maybe 2 hour and a half out there, something like that. And here's where that volcano is, Cerro Brujo, and the place where Darwin first landed is right in this spot right there. And this is the craterized district I'm going to talk about in a moment, where Darwin hiked up there. And so this is that beach where Darwin first spent the night. This is that now extinct volcano, Cerro Brujo. And here's a picture of that craterized district. That's me right there. Photograph taken by Frank Sulloway. And you can see all the different volcanic cones that built this island. So Darwin was one of the first to deduce that this is how islands are formed that are deep out in the ocean. That is not continental islands that are on the continental shelf, but islands that form from volcanic eruptions at the base of the ocean floor. This is how Darwin describes this scene. The entire surface of this part of the island seems to have been permeated like a sieve by the subterranean vapors. Here and there the lava, whilst soft, has been blown into great bubbles, and in other parts the tops of caverns similarly have fallen in, leaving circular pits with steep sides. From the regular form of the many craters, they gave to the country an artificial appearance, which vividly reminded me of those parts of Staffordshire where the great iron foundries are most numerous. Here's a picture of Frank on the left here and a couple of our traveling companions, myself after several weeks of not shaving, as you can see. The Galapagos Islands are a fairly difficult place to spend much time in because there's not much water there. It's right on the equator. It's hot. It's dry. Sun goes down at 6 o'clock. It comes up at 6 a.m. So you're basically in dark for 12 hours in your tent. This is that Cerro Brujo extinct volcano, and this is the beach that I showed you on the aerial photograph where Darwin first spent the night. So we spent the night where Darwin spent the night. You can't do that without permission. Frank is a regular goer to the Galapagos, and he gets permits to hike and camp and explore different parts of the islands, all part of his sort of lifelong journey of retracing Darwin's footsteps, both literally in the islands and cognitive or intellectually in the history of science. So you have these massive backpacks that you have to carry 2 to 3 days of water, which is a lot, particularly in my case, because I sweat a lot. But Frank also arranged for a boat to drop these containers that had more food and water that we could then replenish ourselves further on the other side of the island. Anyway, that's just to kind of give you an idea. It's one of those bucket list places you should go to. It's not difficult to get to at all. And it's there are 64 different places where you can officially stop. You don't need a permit for that. Yeah, but you do have to have a guide with you through one of the many, many guide boats that take you around. Here is one of the little mini tiny skip boats that we took to go from island to island, which is a pretty rough way to go. As you can see, Frank doesn't look too happy there. You just sort of bounce along on the ocean for hours between islands when you don't have a big ship to go on. In this case, we were just going around by small boat. Here was Frank's original boat from, I think it was 35 years before, the first time he'd come to the Galapagos. We actually managed to find that boat, now obviously retired. And there's a young Frank Sulloway with his backpack from the 1970s, sitting on the back of one of these gigantic Galapagos tortoises. That was the first time I went, 1986, at the Darwin station there, and petting one of those giant tortoises. This is the hotel we stayed at in Puerto Bacareza Moreno there on San Cristobal. It's a really high-tech 5-star hotel. It's a beauty. Like, here's the electrical system. Oh, boy. Here's the shower. You reach up to kind of adjust the shower head, and you look up, and here's like these bare wires with duct tape, electrical tape holding it together. Oh, my gosh. Pretty primitive, but that's what kind of made it adventurous. So here we are hiking with these massive packs carrying all the water from that beach we were staying at, which is right down here. And that's that extinct volcano, Cerro Brujo, hiking up to the craterized district that Darwin wrote about. And it's pretty rough going. There's two kinds of lava there. This Pahoehoe lava, it's sort of rope-shaped. These are lava flows that move very slowly. So they cool in these long sort of rope-like structures, or lava, which is kind of broken up and super sharp like glass. Probably named because when you walk on it, you go, maybe. So here again is that beautiful craterized district. Just spectacular, beautiful scenes like this all over the islands. Camping is not so nice. You're just basically lying on hard rock. So you had these little pads, but you had to carry them with you, so they can't be too terribly thick. And in any case, we survived all right. Here's Darwin's description of this crater. Oh, I already read that. Yes, that's right. We read that already. Darwin talked about these lava tubes. So the lava forms, it's kind of rolling along, and then it slows and cools on the outside, but the interior keeps rolling, keeps pushing through, and you end up with this kind of hollow shell that then breaks open later. Again, you have to have pretty thick hiking boots, leather gloves. You can see my legs all scratched up. Probably should have worn long pants. I had long pants, but it's so hot that it just feels good to have shorts on. We also brought with us a copy of Darwin's notebooks when he was there. So this little drawing from Darwin's notebook is of this side of Cerro Brujo. It's a geological map, so it's not meant to accurately portray what it looks like, but what kind of rocks it's formed out of. And you can see that here, the cross hatching he uses to just show that this is a different kind of rock than this and this. And here in his illegible handwriting is his description of this now extinct volcano. Frank can read the handwriting. I can't. So here's one of these geological maps again, from Darwin's notebook and from actual photograph that Frank took there of that, showing that different kinds of rocks and strata and formation. In in his book on the voyage of the Beagle and the chapter on the Galapagos archipelago, Darwin describes Kicker Rock. It's a formal core of a volcano in which the sides have eroded away and left that kind of hard tuft. And there it is. You can still see it out there, sticking dramatically up. It's a great place to scuba dive. I scuba dive there right in between that little place right there. You just hire a boat. They take you out there. They drop you right down. You go right down the side of the volcanic tuft there, and the sea life is unbelievably rich on the side. That was a rough day for me. I've been a scuba diver my whole life, but for some reason I got claustrophobic about, I don't know, maybe 50, 60 feet down, just looking up, and it just seemed like I could just drown. I don't know. Never had a panic attack like that in the water, and just, I don't know what it is. Who knows? But it was pretty spectacular. Then here's Darwin from his notes on the tortoises. I have not as yet noticed by far the most remarkable feature in the natural history of this archipelago. It is that the different islands, to a considerable extent, are inhabited by a different set of beings. My attention was first called to this fact by the vice governor, Mr. Lawson, declaring that the tortoises differed from the different islands, and that he could with certainty tell from which island any one was brought. Very interesting. And Darwin then just sort of kept that in the back of his head, although he wasn't super careful about the collections he made when he was in the archipelago, noting which island and which part of which island each specimen was from, which he would have done had he been an evolutionist there, but he wasn't yet. That's going to be the point of this. He was still a creationist when he was in the Galapagos. But anyway, here's that observation. Different islands, Hispaniola, Pinta, Pinzon, San Cristobal, and Santiago, all have different species or subspecies of these giant tortoises, and the carapaces differ. Look how high up that carapace is of that tortoise on Hispaniola versus the very rounded shell of the giant tortoises on San Cristobal. The reason for that is because, like, the high up shell like that is on Hispaniola, the cactus fruit is very high, so they have to crawl up there to get the cactus fruit, those that eat that. Also, of course, the finches, Darwin's finches, Geospiza being the most popular one there. You can get really close to these birds. This is a photograph I took. I did have a long lens, but again, you don't have to be that far away. And Frank wrote a couple of important papers, first to show that Darwin was not an evolutionist when he was in the Galapagos, in which Frank showed that Darwin was not careful about the location of where he found these different specimens. So these are the actual specimens of finches that Darwin either trapped or shot when he was on the islands, and they're now at I believe in Cambridge, where Frank went to see these. And Frank also tracked the notes of when Darwin visited the ornithologist John Gould in 1849. Again, Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle, 1831 to 1835. So we're talking 14 years later. And this is still 10 years before The Origin of Species is published in 1859. Darwin is still working out how these birds came to be that are on this island, and he misidentified a lot of his specimens. And so Frank found the notes that Darwin took when he was visiting Gould, the ornithologist Gould, on that particular day. I always like this little bit here is this little shrew upside down that Darwin had drawn there. So that's good. I can't read the handwriting very well, but I can see the shrew there. Anyway, Frank's discovery here is Darwin's handwriting of the different specimens of finches, and so Frank's point of this is that and there's one of the mockingbirds, and here's an entry in Darwin's ornithological catalog about his mockingbird collection that Frank notes. When I see these islands in sight of each other, and possessed of but a scanty stock of animals, tenanted by these birds, but slightly differing in structure and filling the same place in nature, I must suspect they are only varieties. Okay, this is the key here. I must suspect, that is, I believe they're only varieties. Varieties. Similar varieties of fixed kinds, not evolution of separate species. So Frank's conclusion here is that Darwin was still a creationist in the Galapagos. He didn't discover evolution when he was in the Galapagos. That's a myth, and Frank debunked that myth. And this explains why Darwin did not even bother to record the island locations of the few finches he collected, and they were never specifically mentioned in the Origin of Species. Wow. Same thing with Darwin's collection of the magnificent Galapagos tortoises. Instead of recording all the islands and locations of the specimens, they stored them in the bowels of the Beagle and ate them on the way to Australia. They ate their data. It's crazy. Anyway. And in fact, when I mentioned that, it's like, what? They took the tortoises and ate them? Yeah. That was quite common at the time. This is how goats got to the Galapagos, is that sailors and pirates left them there to come back and eat them later. And they also absconded with tortoises and ate the meat. Just kept them in the bowels of the ship because they don't need a lot of food or water. They can live for months without anything. Here's an expedition from 1905, the California Academy of Sciences, collecting these huge tortoise shells. Here's a picture of one I took when I was there, with his number on the back. So I first see him, I think, oh boy, I take a nice close-up of him, and out in the wild, nature and raw, except they've all been numbered. Some of them have names. Every specimen of pretty much every species has been accounted for by the naturalists there today. I mentioned the goats. Here's a cute little baby goat that we found that are no more. They've all been shot by hunters, purposely sent there by the Ecuadorian government, because these goats eat the vegetation that the tortoises eat. So they had to make a triage kind of decision to restore the natural state of the islands. What's natural? Well, the tortoises have been there millions of years. The goats have been there a little over a century or two. The tortoises win. These poor goats, I mean, I feel kind of bad because, they didn't choose to be there, but that's how it goes. Anyway, Darwin returned home, married his cousin, as you do, Emma Wedgwood, part of the famous and wealthy Wedgwood pottery family, and he bought this house here, which is still there. This is about 16 miles southeast of downtown London, right, just sort of the London center there. Very close, actually, by today's standards, but in the late 1830s when he moved there, it was quite a ways away from there. And they started having children. He had lots and lots of children. And he opened a notebook in which he began making notes about his ideas from his voyage, some pictures of it. And this is probably the most famous drawing from his entire opus pre-1859, The Origin of Species. It's the first tree of life. The idea that one specimen landing in one place on an island can then radiate out from there and become different species, A, B, C, D. And he writes here cryptically, I think what? Well, I think there might be something to this tree of life. And so this is now called adaptive radiation. You can even get a tattoo. If you just Google scientific tattoos, you'll find double helixes and all kinds of Feynman diagrams and all kinds of things. But here is the famous Darwin. C. Darwin, 1837. So this is a diagram for the now famous Darwin finches. You only need one, maybe one couple or one pregnant female, or it's just something that lands out 600 miles out in the Galapagos and then radiates out and becomes different. Some are insectivores, some are ground finches that eat seeds, some are cactus feeding, and so on. And so you end up with this great variety from one specimen. You can see what he's trying to do. He's trying to figure out where species come from. So The Origin of Species is not a book about the origins of life. That's a completely different topic. Darwin, really barely addresses that in his work. It's really the origin of species that we're talking about here. And so this now then gets solidified in it's a beautiful pull-out diagram in The Origin of Species of that adaptive radiation, how you just start with one and that branches out to all these different kinds. So this is an important idea because these are all, in a sense, cousins to one another. They're related to one. This is time going from bottom to top is past to present, not left to right, as you often see it. And so it to ask how this one comes from this one and that they coexist is the wrong question. They have a common ancestor going back in time. That's the idea. So he published The Origin of Species in 1859. Here's a photograph of the first edition, which I owned for quite a while. First print run of the first edition, which is when I sold my copy. Well, I'll give you the backstory here. In the mid-1990s, a retired biologist offered to give us Skeptic Society, my 501c3 nonprofit organization that I run, a gift of a donation of the entire collection of Darwin first editions. So I was happy to receive that, of course. And he duly got a tax write-off for that donation, and I hung on to them until 2009, the 150th anniversary of the Origin of Species and the 200th anniversary of Darwin's birth, and sold it for $125,000 for the one book. $125,000. It's probably double that now. Who knows? That's kind of another world I don't really deal with in that much, the antiquarian book. But I was always nervous having it. And at the time, the Skeptics was low on funds, so I invested the money to start an endowment for the Skeptic Society, which has been growing ever since then because I put it in the stock market at that low, really bottomed out market after the '08 crash. And so now we have something of an endowment so that when I'm gone, the Skeptic Society will continue its work in science education and critical thinking. Anyway, okay, well, Darwin once wrote an observation that I've called Darwin's dictum. This is actually the title of my very first Scientific American column. And it is this: how odd it is that anyone should not see that all observation must be for or against some view, if it is to be of any service. Now, Darwin wrote this in a letter to a friend after The Origin of Species was published, in which the British Association for the Advancement of Science held a big conference to debate the new theory that everybody was talking about. And Darwin didn't go. His colleagues went in his stead, as it were. And one of them wrote to him and said, they said your book is too theoretical, that you should just let the facts speak for themselves. Like any good naturalist, you just lay out the facts on a table or your fossils or your specimens or whatever, and let people deduce whatever they want. Well, Darwin was too good of a theoretical scientist to let that go. And that's why he noted all observation is for or against some view, if it's to be of any service. So all books, all my books, for example, write for or against some point of view. And they all should. All books should do that. So what book was Darwin writing against? It was the works of William Paley, Archdeacon of Carlisle, containing his life, moral and political philosophy, evidences of Christianity, natural theology, and so forth. Okay, natural theology. This was the study of theology through nature. That is, you have God's words, the Bible, and God's works, nature. Right? You go out in nature and you look and you see how they coordinate. And it was William Paley's works that Darwin told his friend John Lubbock in 1859, I do not think I hardly ever admired a book more than Paley's Natural Theology. I could almost formally have said it by heart. Aha. So what's so interesting and important about this? It's Paley that gave us the famous watchmaker argument. And here it is. In crossing a heath, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone and were asked how the stone came to be there, I might possibly answer that for anything I knew. To the contrary, it had lain there forever. But suppose I found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. The inference, we think, is inevitable, that the watch must have had a maker. that there must have existed at some time and in some place or other an artificer or artificers who formed it for the purpose which we find it actually to answer, who comprehended its construction and designed its use. Right? So, I mean, it's a good argument, right? Stones are too simple, but a watch has too many elements to it to have come about naturally because there was no theory to explain how that could possibly happen. So, divine command, as it were, the theist argument was the only game in town. And that's the argument that Paley's making. Darwin read that in college when he was an undergraduate, and he held that in the back of his mind. How could you get something as complex as a watch without a divine designer? Okay, this is still the question on the table for intelligent design creationists because they don't accept a lot of Darwinian evolution. That's for the part 2 of this lecture. So what is Darwin arguing in The Origin of Species? 1, evolution. That is, organisms change through time. Both the fossil record of life's history and nature today document and reveal this change. 2, descent with modification. Evolution proceeds via branching through common descent. Offspring are similar to, but not exact replicas of their parents. This produces the necessary variation to allow for adaptation to an ever-changing environment. 3, gradualism. Change is slow, steady, and stately. Given enough time, evolution accounts for species change. So this was against the idea of what was called catastrophism, that change is sudden, dramatic, and huge. And, flood geology, that's a kind of catastrophism. And Darwin was saying, no, that it's slow and gradual. You can barely see it in your own lifetime. 4, multiplication of speciation. That is, evolution does not just produce new species, it produces an increasing number of new species. All right. And 5, the mechanism, natural selection. That is the process of evolutionary change co-discovered by Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, which operates in the following manner. Okay, these 5, by the way, were best articulated by the great evolutionary theorist Ernst Mayr, who said, kind of solidified what this entire long book encapsulates. Those are the 5 points. Now, the most important one, there were other theories of evolution at the time. The most important element of these 5 is the mechanism of natural selection. How does it work? 1, populations tend to increase indefinitely in a geometric ratio, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, 1024, and so on. But in a natural environment, population numbers stabilize at a certain level. They can't continue to grow like that. You're gonna exceed the carrying capacity of the environment fairly quickly. Therefore, there must be a struggle for existence because not all of the organisms produced can survive. This struggle for existence gives this kind of this meme of the survival of the fittest, like nature red and tooth and claw and all that stuff. But what Darwin's talking about is anything that helps you survive. Coloration, the length of your neck. You could be super slow and small. You could be super simple. It's not necessarily being, a big badass lion. That's not just what struggle for existence means. D, there's variation in every species. And E, in the struggle for existence, those individuals with variations that are better adapted to the environment leave behind more offspring, that's the key, than individuals that are less well adapted. And this is known as differential reproductive success, right? Some have more babies than others, or they have babies that they get to adulthood more than others. And that's what carries on the genes. That is the variation that was best adapted for that particular environment at that particular time is that survives, gets passed on to future generations. So that's the key to explaining how natural selection works that drives evolution. Again, evolutionary theory was already around. There are other theories of evolution, but none of them had a mechanism for how it could work. It's an interesting problem in the philosophy of science. Can a scientific theory be accepted without a mechanism? And the answer is yes. In a way, this does, because Darwin didn't know what was the mechanism of variation and how these variations get passed on to future generations, because they didn't know about genes and DNA and all that back then. Now, I mentioned Alfred Russel Wallace as the co-discoverer. So, parenthetically, somebody was going to discover this. So Darwin gets the credit, of course, and he deserves it. But had neither Wallace nor Darwin existed, somebody would have figured this out because it's there to be discovered. So this isn't like Beethoven's Fifth, that no Beethoven's Fifth, right? So you're discovering that. Now, Wallace was very different from Darwin. Quite a bit younger. He was born in 1823 versus Darwin born in 1809. He was born from a large family like. Okay, we had a little computer crash there, which happens with this program. So I'm returning to where we were, which was talking about Wallace and the Malay Archipelago, and he co-discovered the theory of natural selection. And he wrote it up. He was on this little island here, the Aru Islands, in the Malay Archipelago. And in February 1858, while he's in this little hut, something like this little hut, here in a feverish fit of malaria, he has this awakening in which he figures out how nature is creating new species, and he writes it up in an essay that he titled "On the Tendency of Varieties to Depart Indefinitely from the Original Type." Not quite as catchy as "On the Origin of Species," but it was a paper, not a book. And so here's how he articulated it. 1, the life of wild animals is a struggle for existence. He uses the same phrase as Darwin. They knew each other by correspondence only. They were not super close. He wasn't reading. He didn't get that from Darwin. Darwin hadn't published yet. 2, populations increase geometrically. Again, same as, because both Wallace and Darwin read Malthus and his treatise on population increases. 3, the population must have reached its limits and have become stationary in a very few years after the origin of each species. Notice the language, so similar, it's incredible. 4, therefore, large numbers of individuals must perish. They do. 5, variation is the key to determining who will perish. 6, useful variations will tend to increase, useless or hurtful variations to diminish. And 7, those variations most likely to survive will displace those that are not, and over time, the variety would now have replaced the species of which it would be a more perfectly developed and more high organized form. Such a variety could not return to the original form, for that form is an inferior one and could never compete with it for existence. All right, so he writes up this essay and he sends it. Okay, he's in the Malay Archipelago. So this is, there's no email, right? He just writes it up, puts a stamp on it, puts it on the next boat that's going back to England. Along with another letter he wrote to another colleague named Frederick Bates, stamped Arrival London, June 3rd, 58, sent on the same ship as the Darwin letter. Okay, so he sends this letter, previous letter, to Darwin, same batch, so we know that July 3rd, 58 is when it would have arrived, and Darwin gets it on June 18th, or at least so he says. He writes a letter to his friend Charles Lyell, the great geologist, on June 18th, 1858. There's Lyell and Darwin. And so Darwin writes to Lyell, some year or so ago, you recommended me to read a paper by Wallace in the Annals. This is a different paper than the one I was just quoting from, which had interested you, and as I was writing to him, I knew this would please him much, so I told him. He has today sent me the enclosed and asked me to forward it to you. It seems to me well worth reading. Your words have come true with a vengeance that I should be forestalled. I never saw a more striking coincidence. If Wallace had my manuscript sketch written out in 1842, he could not have made a better short extract. Even his terms now stand as heads of my chapters. So all my originality, whatever it may amount to, will be smashed. Okay. I'm being a little dramatic here because you can just imagine what it must have felt like for Darwin. He's been home for 20 years, more than 20 years, working on his theory. He's published nothing. He's writing it out. He's very cautious. He's very slow, methodical, like the theory he's describing of evolution, and for a good reason, because in 1844, an anonymous author published this book, The Vestiges of Creation. It was a theory of evolution with no mechanism and not much evidence. And it was pilloried in the scientific community. And Darwin could see, you know what, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to be very careful. And his older colleagues said, who knew about his theory, said, hey, look, take it easy, go slow. You don't want to do what this guy did and be embarrassed. So take your time, no rush. And then all of a sudden he gets this letter from Wallace on the other side of the world going, hey, I had this crazy idea about evolution and the origin of species. And Darwin's like, oh, crap. My work, originality, will be smashed. Okay. Now, I have to say there's a conspiracy theory that Darwin stole Wallace's ideas. Okay, this is not true. I've looked into it. I have a whole chapter about the alleged priority dispute. It wasn't between Wallace and Darwin. They settled it quite amicably. In fact, the Linnaean Society meeting that year, July 1st, 1858, Wallace's paper and 2 of Darwin's earlier draft essays describing his theory were read into the record. And you can go there and you can see this is kind of a reconstruction there. The original building is apparently gone now. But Darwin had already, in a letter and a draft essay, articulated those very points that Wallace was describing, unbeknownst to Wallace many years before Wallace. So the credit to Darwin is properly given there. In any case, the Linnaean Society, I think, appropriately published Wallace's essay and Darwin's, the 2 pieces from Darwin. And 50 years later, they struck a 50th anniversary celebration medal. And so I think the credit for as co-discoverers of natural selection is appropriate, with the lion's share of the credit being given to Darwin. Wallace, therefore, is in Darwin's shadow, which is why I titled my book that. So, in short, natural selection is variation, selection, and inheritance. Mom, Dad, there's something you need to know. I'm a mammal, says this former reptile. Of course, this never happened, as Richard Dawkins likes to say. No Homo sapiens, no Homo erectus mother ever gave birth to a Homo sapien baby. I mean, it's not how it works. Okay, much more. Every species is adapted for that environment at that particular time, and it's that fixed species. It's not on its way to becoming something else. We're going to see how not understanding that properly leads to a creationist mindset. As usual, Dawkins says it probably better than anybody. Summarizing natural selection in a T-shirt slogan: random mutation plus non-random cumulative selection. Okay, so the genetic mutations are random, but evolution and natural selection is not random. It's non-random cumulative selection. It's the selection part that's the key that allows it to accumulate traits that are more adaptive to the changing environment than other traits, and they get passed on. That's the key. The key to natural selection is differential reproductive success because of heritable variance. That is, everyone has ancestors, but not everyone leaves descendants. So natural selection provided 3 key answers. 1, it explained change over time, that is, descent with modification. 2, it explained the apparent purposive design quality of component parts. A wing is designed to fly. Eyes are designed to see. So, yes, nature is designed. Paley's watchmaker argument falls when you have a different causal explanation, in this case, adaptive function. Wings are adapted to fly. Eyes are adapted to see, and that adaptation happens from the bottom up, not the top down, by intentional design. And 3, the theory united all species into one grand tree of descent, including humans. That branching tree applies to all life. So, as Darwin concluded in his view of life, this is the concluding graph from The Origin of Species. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one. And that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. That is beautiful writing. The Origin of Species is a beautifully written book. It's worth reading still. Actually, you can get it on audio where Richard Dawkins reads it, which is really spectacular. Okay, so why does Darwin matter? Well, this was my concluding remarks from my book of that title. Darwin matters because evolution matters. Evolution matters because science matters. And science matters because it is the preeminent story of our age, an epic saga about who we are, where we came from, and where we're going. And of course, it's controversial because it bumps up against religion. So I want to say a few words about Darwin's religion. I have a whole chapter devoted to this in Why Darwin Matters. Darwin once wrote, "What a book a devil's chaplain might write on the clumsy, wasteful, blundering low, and horridly cruel works of nature." I mean, here's just a dead dolphin from the Galapagos, a picture I took. There are dead animals everywhere, right? Nature red in tooth and claw. I mean, there's nothing nice about nature. What kind of a designer, an all-good, all-powerful, all-knowing deity would create a system like the one we live in? Okay, this is sort of Darwin's point. He also wrote about the ignominid wasp. "I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent God would have designedly created the ignominid with the express intention of their feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars." Okay, so this wasp stings a caterpillar and paralyzes it, and then implants its eggs in the tail end of the caterpillar. And when the eggs hatch, the larvae devour the caterpillar all the way up until the little, doesn't really have a brain, it's the neural nodule there at the top of its head, it is left for last, so that it keeps it alive until the larvae are able to fly away. I mean, what kind of a good God would do that? This is what Darwin is asking. And he continues, "Or that a cat should play with mice. Not believing this, I see no necessity in the belief that the eye was expressly designed." Okay, so this is not in The Origin of Species, by the way. This is separate. He's writing in letters and essays and whatnot. Here's a few pictures from dead animals around the Galapagos I took. They're everywhere. You can't even help these, like if you see a struggling baby sea lion, it can't find its mother, and it's like, you want to go pick it up, you can't. You're not allowed to touch the animals there. What really changed Darwin's religious thinking was the death of his daughter Annie. I highly recommend Randall Kane's book, Annie's Box, about that. Here is what he says, that there is much suffering, this is Darwin speaking now, that there is much suffering in the world, no one disputes. Some have attempted to explain this with reference to man by imagining that it serves for his moral improvement. But the number of men in the world is as nothing compared with that of all other sentient beings, and they often suffer greatly without any moral improvement. Okay, so what's the point of suffering? Oh, it makes you a stronger person. Yeah, well, what about all these other sentient beings that suffer and so on? How is that improving their morality? I mean, he's kind of dismantling theists' arguments without really intending to do so. He's just dealing with particular issues. Later in life, he got a lot of letters. People just asked him point blank, "Do you believe in God?" He answered one, "In my most extreme fluctuations, I've never been an atheist in the sense of denying the existence of God. I think that generally, and more as I grow older, but not always, that an agnostic would be the more correct description of my state of mind." Okay, now here he's using the word atheist in the strong atheist sense, that is, the denial of God's existence. The weak atheist position is just lack of belief in a God. That's different than saying, I know there is no God, I don't know, versus I don't know if there's a God. You see the difference there. Now, agnostic, that's a term coined by Darwin's colleague and friend Thomas Henry Huxley, also defender of Darwin's theory. He was called Darwin's bulldog. In 1869, Huxley wrote, "When I reached intellectual maturity and began to ask myself whether I was an atheist, a theist, or a pantheist, I found that the more I learned and reflected, the less ready was the answer. They, believers, were quite sure they had attained a certain gnosis, had more or less successfully solved the problem of existence. Well, I was quite sure I had not, and had a pretty strong conviction that the problem was insoluble." Okay, so what Huxley meant by agnostic is not that I'm waiting for some more information before I make up my mind. and it could go either way. No, he's saying you'll never make up your mind because there will never be enough evidence. It's an insoluble problem that is God's existence. Okay. Now, I'm not 100% convinced of that, although I think that's a good argument. In any case, Darwin had a different perspective. He writes, continues, "It appears to me, whether rightly or wrongly, that direct arguments against Christianity and theism produce hardly any effect on the public, and freedom of thought is best promoted by the gradual illumination of men's minds, which follows from the advance of science. It has therefore always been my object to avoid writing on religion, and I've confined myself to science." So you'll not find in Darwin's oeuvre a big book on God. There's nothing like that. He just promotes science. He just advances science. He's doing science. And if you come to become a non-believer through that, fine. But he's not trying to convert you to atheism or anything like that. He had additional motives. His wife was very religious. This is a continuation of the previous quote. "I may, however, have been unduly biased by the pain which it would give some members of my family if I aided in any way direct attacks on religion." Okay, Emma was a deeply religious woman. She deeply loved Charles and was very upset and worried about his theory leading him to atheism, and because she was worried about his eternal soul. I mean, if you believe in the eternal soul, the existence of your being in some other format forever, and that this person doesn't get to go where you're going because they don't believe, that would make you feel bad. So he respected that. This is captured in this beautiful film called Creation, starring Paul Bettany as Darwin and Jennifer Connelly as his wife Emma. So here's the trailer of that. I'm sure you could find it on Hulu or Netflix or one of those. All right. Let me see if I can capture that here. Here we go. Okay.
Tell me a story.
All right, what about?
About everything.
Everything. Very well, then.
In the beginning, it was just a simple idea.
Clear evidence of transformation. Mr. Darwin, your theory is hugely powerful.
But it would test his faith.
It changes everything. Suppose everyone stopped believing that God had any sort of plan for us. Apart from anything else, it would break your mother's heart.
And divide.
These are your thoughts, Charles. They are not mine.
The whole world.
Clearly the Almighty can no longer claim to have authored every species in under a week. You've killed God, sir.
Do you not care that you and I may be separated for all eternity?
Well, of course I care. Of course I do.
Strike hard with a blow that is utterly conclusive.
You say you take no comfort from religion, but do you have faith?
You do have enemies.
But you have friends, too.
I owe it to my children to have the courage of my own convictions. My title will be On the Origin of Species. I shall keep God out of it. I'm finished.
Supposing I think it should be destroyed.
Read it first. There is grandeur in this view of life. From so simple a beginning, endless forms, most wonderful, have been and are being evolved.
Yeah, fantastic. Great film. Okay, so back to our Benninger's headlines law. The answer is no. Is Darwin wrong? No, the evidence for evolution is overwhelming. Beautiful article by David Quammen. The Evolution Wars. Oh boy. Here's just a few scenes from that. The editorial cartoons This is when the Kansas Board of Education voted to have the theory of creationism taught in public schools. You're now leaving Kansas. This is the iconic left to right, simple to complex, hunched over to erect time-life sequence. Here's George W. Bush representing intelligent design, although he didn't really defend it like other theists have. Here's some other images. I'm going to show a bunch of these. I got this idea of collecting these from Stephen Jay Gould. He used to show this incorrect ladder of progress toward humans. That's not how evolution works, but it's how creationists think it works, and therefore they find flaws in it. They should find flaws in it, because that's not how evolution actually works. Here's another editorial cartoon. This is about the latest creationism thing. This was intelligent design theory in Dover, Pennsylvania, with creationism as the wolf, intelligent design in the sheep's clothes, run by the monkey of religious right. One of their arguments is teach both theories and let the kids decide. What? Chemistry and alchemy, phrenology and neurology, magic and physics, astrology and astronomy? No. Here's the Creation Museum in Kentucky, which I went to visit. It's quite the sight. You can, at least they used to have the dinosaur with the saddle that you can strap on and ride, which reminded me of the scene at the start of Lindsay Lohan's film Mean Girls, where the narrator says that on the third day, God created the Remington bolt-action rifle so that man could fight the dinosaurs and the homosexuals. Oh boy, what a stereotype, but funny anyway. So you go there, and they have the 7 C's in God's eternal plan: creation, corruption, catastrophe, confusion, Christ, cross, and consummation. So when you go there, they sort of take you down one pathway of their timeline. The whole thing was created in 4004 BC to the present, and then they walk you through the whole Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve artfully covered in flowers and hair, and the dragon and or snake tempts Eve with the apple, and she eats from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and then they have a fun romp in the bushes, and they know sin, and the rest is the fall. Before the fall, by the way, dinosaurs were vegetarians. They didn't eat each other. There was no predation because there was no evil. And so when I asked my guide, well, what's with the gigantic teeth of these dinosaurs here, like this one? And it was explained to me that they were originally for cracking open coconuts and hard seeds like that. Sure. Here's Ken Ham, who runs that museum, noted young Earth creationist, and his ark and explanation that the ark held all the animals, including the dinosaurs. How did it fit those gigantic dinosaurs? They were babies. Okay. Then there's the original Left Behinders. When the flood comes, the ark is left behind, left on top of top of Mount Ararat, and these sinners were fallen away here. And, and here's a billboard for the life-size ark that they built in 2016-2017, now open, although I understand it's having some financial difficulties. Thank God you can't sink this ship. All right, there it is under construction. I haven't visited the place since they built this one, but apparently it's quite the sight to see. This is what evolutionists think about creationism. It's a boat full of holes. This is my favorite cartoon about the demise of the dinosaurs. Oh crap, was that today? Any case, so when you go down the other hallway in the Creation Museum, you end up with, science, materialism, and all these deep existential questions that go unanswered because science doesn't answer these questions. This is what they say. Of course, I disagree with that. Why am I here? Am I alone? Why do I suffer? Is there any hope? Why do we have to die? Of course, they have final answers to those. But if you accept science, you end up with a billboard like this. Only 1 in 3 teens say that they will continue to participate in church life once they're living on their own. That's from George Barnes. He's a Christian pollster, and this is their own data. This is what they're worried about, right? You go up to college and take a course in evolution. Before you know it, you're an atheist, and then you have no morals. No heaven, no hell, just science inside the crusade against religion. This is a wall-size image I took when I was there. Terry Schiavo, euthanasia, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, gay marriage, the whole thing. It's all going to hell without God. All right. Here's a comment from a Dover resident in the intelligent design creationism trial in Pennsylvania. I would definitely prefer to believe that God created me than I'm the 50th cousin to a silverback ape. So you kind of capturing what bothers people. Like, we're just one of those. Yeah, 98% similar to those. In fact, we share 98% of our genes with our chimp cousins. Here's another editorial cartoon, this by a believer. The BC comic cartoonist was a believer. If man evolved from the ape, how come there's still apes around? Some of them were given choices. That's an actual answer to the question. But it's the wrong question, because we didn't evolve from apes. Apes and humans evolved from a common ancestor. Now back to this problem. So here's an image from a textbook. Gibbon, orang, chimpanzee, gorilla, man, as if from left to right, which is the iconography of how most history is portrayed visually, from left to right, from past to present, as if this is the sequence. Here's an actual museum display showing this very thing, from the gibbons, chimps, gorillas to humans, as if we came from gorillas and gorillas came from chimps. Not at all the case. We're all cousins from a common ancestor. That myth of progressive evolution, and that humans came from apes, goes way back. This is the most famous version of it from the Time Life foldout, showing our evolution. But I actually found a 1925 version from Judge magazine in which a cake eater apparently was an insult sequence there. So the myth is modernized. Those of you who are just listening to this, you're going to miss all these great visuals of the iconography from left to right. I'll just kind of scroll through them. This is social commentary, obviously. More social commentary on the EU. This is when Europe was constructing the EU, and a lot of people are against it. More social commentary on the obesity problem, on being stuck at computers, too much partying, too much texting, pollution, the bicycle, the Segway. I like this, the dawn of ego. Hey, what do you want from me? All I know is you're not on the list to get into heaven. No pets, right? The aliens are in the midst there. We turn into barcodes. We nuke ourselves. Rock, dance. More obesity issues. The evolution of Yoda. The evolution of Gangnam Style. V for revolution. And Homer. One of my favorite couch gags at the start of The Simpsons. They always show the... Let me see if I can show this here. Let's see, how do I play this? There we go.
Hi.
So I show that just because the image of this sequence is so burned into our pop culture, but it's wrong. I mean, here's the image from left to right, going from advanced to less advanced, supposedly reverse evolution. Again, none of this is right. Iconography is usually left to right, so this looks kind of weird. Going right to left, again, right to left is weird. Very jarring to the eye. We're so used to that left to right. This one, go back, we fucked up everything. Again, more social commentary. Even The Planet of the Apes, one of my favorite films, the original one with Charlton Heston. Remember the scene at the end where he's on the beach and he realizes that He's home. He's been on Earth the entire time, and the apes took over. And as if this could happen, like there's some built-in sequence. We're supposed to develop language and technology and so on, and if it's not us, it would be the apes, something like this. So even that great film captures that image that I think is incorrect, because in reality it's more like a richly branching tree with lots of branches and twigs and so forth, in which this is past to present from bottom to top, in which all of us at the top here, and this is contemporary to Darwin. This is from, I think, the 1870s or 80s image. But again, this is not quite right, even with all the branches, because the author put us right at the top, like we're the pinnacle of evolution. No, a more accurate one would be, just that we're just these animals right here, just one of many different twigs here. And in reality, it's much more richly branching like this. We're going to just be right over here, these of the great apes, mammals, great apes. Blow it up a little bit like this. Here we are, humans, all these different species. Nothing's leading inexorably toward us. It's not a ladder. It's a richly branching bush. It's not marching toward us at all. But believing that it does it leads to what I call the fossil fallacy. And that is one fact is not a science make. So creationists will say something like, "How do you explain the links between whales and mammals? Whales are mammals. How do they get there?" And so they'll say something like, "Well, so they'll say there's a gap in the fossil record here." Well, when paleontologists fill in the gap, creationists don't go, "Oh, that's how it happened." They go, "Oh, now there's 1, 2, 3, 4 gaps in the fossil record. How do you explain that?" This is the problem with creationism. The more data you have, the worse our theory is supposed to be. Okay, this is a complete reverse of how science really works. I mean, just like here's just one, the Ambulocetus natans, the walking, swimming whale. Here's a skeleton of it, but there's actually quite a few now that have, between the cetaceans and land mammals, there's quite a few transitional fossils, so-called transitional fossils there. In fact, there's lots of examples of this. Here's Time Magazine's Evolution's Big Bang. In Darwin's time, the sudden appearance of trilobites and other fossils was a mystery, and intelligent designers continue to cite this outdated example and claim that the Cambrian explosion is one of the creation events of the Bible. But as Don Prothero points out, from which these slides come, there are an abundant pre-Cambrian fossils, but they're microscopic and were missed until the 1940s. These blue-green bacteria, cyanobacteria, came from rocks 3.5 billion years old. From 3.5 billion years ago to about 700 million years ago, there was no form of life more complex than a single cell, and the only megascopic fossils are the dome-like cyanobacterial mats or stromatolites, which you can find still in Australia. So for 90% of life's history, this was the planet of the scums, not Planet of the Apes. At 700 million years ago, we see the next logical step, multicellular, but not skeletonized yet, soft-bodied animals known as the Ediacara fauna. So they don't leave behind many fossils because they're soft bodies. They just dissolve after they die. At the very beginning of the Cambrian, we next see the logical step, the little shellies, the small organisms which are skeletonized but nowhere near as big as a trilobite, but leave behind some evidence there. And then we finally get to the Burgess Shale of hard-body animals. So the Cambrian explosion actually took over 20 million years. It's not exactly a rapid creation event, as creationists like to think it was. In fact, we have an embarrassment of fossil riches even in the hominid lines. I love this picture of the young, skinny Stephen Jay Gould at the Harvard collection. Of just, again, just think of it as, as bonobos, chimps, bonobos, gorillas, and us. We're cousins with a common ancestor going back about 6 to 8 million years ago. Here's a bunch of different versions of that, just a handful actually of the many we have. Sahelanthropus chirensis, Australopithecus africanus, Kenyanthropus polyps, Australopithecus afarensis, so-called Lucy, Homo habilis, Homo georgicus, Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalensis, Homo sapiens idolitu, Homo neanderthalensis and Homo sapiens side by side, Homo floresiensis at 60,000 years ago, the little hobbit. Here's yet some others that were found just recently in the Philippines. And then, of course, Homer. So it really comes down to this. Is life naturally designed or intelligently designed? Design is natural, not supernatural. And nobody looks at like the beehives and soap bubbles and the structure of sponges as if an intelligent designer by hand creates each of those. We know that natural forces cause these to operate in the way that they do, and that's what we conclude from evolution. That is, take a look at something like the whale's flipper. Is it intelligent design or natural design? Well, if you strip off the flesh, you'll see the tetrapod forelimb of the same bones that you and I have in our upper arm and fingers, phalanges. And that's an example of homologies. It is a common anatomy due to common ancestry. The forelimbs of tetrapods are all the same. Or you get another form of convergence that is homologies, common anatomy due to same thing, common ancestry. Like, whales and hummingbirds. You see this same kind of structure, even though they're not to size. This would be the actual size there. Or why whales still have tiny vestiges of hips and hind limbs buried deeper in their bodies. Or vestigial structures. Creationists can't explain these things, but evolutionary theory can. Like the Cretaceous snake, Pachyarchus problematicus, improbably named, had small hind limbs. So it's legless snakes, but the vestiges of the legs are there. Why would an intelligent designer do that? Makes no sense. Useless legs and snails and wings on flightless birds, a human tailbone, wisdom teeth, male nipples, the human appendix. These are vestigial structures that make no sense. Same thing with the design of the eye. I mean, it's completely backwards because it grows from the inside out. It's brain tissue coming out. And the light-sensitive rods and cones up here, they're at the back of the retina. The light's coming from the bottom here and is passing through all these cells. It makes no sense, but it does when you think of it as how it's developed embryologically from the brain. So we have a convergence of evidence from multiple lines of inquiry. And the same thing with dating techniques and the same thing with evolution. Evolutionary theory is therefore provisionally true because it explains how design happened naturally from the bottom up. It's convergent. Independent lines of inquiry all jump to the same conclusion that evolution happened by means of natural selection. And 3, it predicts new findings that have been confirmed empirically. So life is designed from the bottom up, not the top down. Natural design, not intelligent design. Evolution, not creation. In the next lecture, I will address the actual creationists and intelligent design theorists' arguments and show why they're wrong, as well as give a history of that movement, because it has nothing to do with science. It's a political and religious movement. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.